Thank you, Nadine and the Council of Canadians, for inviting me here tonight. Thank you, Billy Joe, for your prayer. We're going to need them here in Canada. My job tonight is to give you a brief introduction to what may well be Canada's greatest and most dramatic national debate, and that is the future of the Northern Gateway Pipeline project, which is connected, as many of you know, to another project in Alberta known as the tar sands, which is probably the world's largest energy project, largest capital project, largest construction project, and largest mining project. And Mark Twain once defined a mine as this. He said, "It's a big hole in the ground with a liar on top." And I'll explain why. So let's begin. It's an incredible story, really. And every day we are now reading about it in the national press. We are being told by our federal government, we are being told by provincial politicians that we must export bitumen to Asia and that the nation's future is tied to this endeavor. And this endeavor includes building a 1,000-kilometer long pipeline through some of North America's most difficult terrain and across some of North America's most critically important salmon watersheds. This pipeline will have to cross 1,000 rivers and streams before it gets to the Port of Kitimat. Now, it's not one pipeline. It's two pipelines. One pipeline will take bitumen to the Port of Kitimat, and another pipeline will take imported light oil from the Middle East and take it to Alberta so that it can be mixed with bitumen, which is a very low-grade junk crude that will not move through a pipeline unless diluted. And in order to do all of this, we will have to bring as many as 300 to 400 super tankers a year, primarily run by Chinese crews belonging to one of the world's largest corporations, Sinopec, to this coast. And the people supporting this project are two very large state-owned corporations. One of them is PetroChina. The other is Sinopec. They are among the world's 10 largest corporations. These corporations are a bit different. They are owned by the Communist Party of China. Their boards of directors are directly and only accountable to the Communist Party of China. The last chairman of this company, Sinopec, was found guilty of defrauding the Chinese people of several $1 million. Now, the aim of this project, the goal of this project, what is it about? Well, it's about putting more cars on the road in Shanghai. That's what it's about. It's about increasing carbon emissions in the planet. Now, the company that wants to build this pipeline, that is proposing this pipeline, Enbridge, is the same company that owned a pipeline that went through the state of Michigan, that was carried raw bitumen diluted with light oil or naphtha gas. Their pipeline ruptured in 2010, and the company went bananas, and it took them 3 months to admit that the contents of the pipeline were bitumen. And that bitumen, once you get it in a river, doesn't behave like light oil. It does not float. It sinks to the bottom. And so this spill of 20,000 barrels, and by the way, it took them 17 hours to locate this spill, contaminated 39 miles of the Kalamazoo River, and only 3 of which have been cleaned up at a cost of nearly $1 billion, and that took 2 years.
Oh, God.
Imagine a spill like that on the Kitimat River, on the Skeena. Now, what's at risk? You have everything to lose in this province and nothing to gain from this project. You know, this is a Chinese energy project, a project designed to offload a cheap product that we can't be bothered to upgrade or add value to here at home. And we want it to cross your waterways. We want to put at risk your coastline. And we want First Nations to shoulder all of the consequences and get none of the benefits. And First Nations have said that is not good. They've said, forget it. We want no part of this project. We don't want this in our future. This is not our future. This is a demonstration that took place in Prince Rupert. I was fortunate enough to be invited by the GitGat to attend this demonstration. There were 2,000 people in the streets in a city of 15,000 people. And I can tell you, Art was there as well. It was a phenomenal event. And the energy in the auditorium in Prince Rupert was unlike any energy I've ever felt before in this country. And when the GitGat went up and they danced, they were dancing for their people, they were dancing for their land, they were dancing for the salmon, they were dancing for the humpback whales, they were dancing for the spirit bears, they were dancing for the conscience of this country. Now here's a fellow that's not dancing very well these days. This is what I call Comrade Joe Oliver. And Comrade Joe is actually having a meeting with Comrade Fu of Sinopec. And here's what, and Joe Oliver is the one that has characterized First Nations and environmental groups, or anyone who has questioned the economics, politics, and environmental impact of this project as foreign radicals. And then he makes statements like this. Our government believes that the free market is the most efficient and cost-effective means to ensure the proper allocation of resources for the development and supply of energy. Now, either Joe Oliver is extremely ignorant or he is lying, because there is no free market for oil in China. We would not be selling bitumen to a free market. We are selling bitumen to a market that is controlled by 3 different state corporations that are only accountable to the Communist Party of China. And they bring up prices and bring them down when they feel like it, for their own social and political needs in China. So Comrade Joe is not serving free markets, he's serving very much a closed market in China. So we're having a public hearing, and we're beginning to have the beginnings of what will be an extraordinary national debate, and the outcome will really decide our future as a country. In the sense that if this pipeline is built, it will increase the magnitude of the current tar sands mining project threefold. Threefold. We're at around 2 million barrels a day. This project, without any national conversation about pace or scale of the development, would take it up to 6 million barrels. Now, let's talk a bit about the resource, and it's important for Canadians to really understand what this resource is all about. And it's important for us to acknowledge at the same time that we are a mining people. And the reason we fear a conversation about the pace and scale of this project, and the reason that opponents have been demonized, is because we don't want to have a conversation about ourselves, about our character, and who we are as a people, and what are we doing to this country. So bitumen is a really extreme resource. It's an example of an unconventional hydrocarbon. It takes a lot of money, it takes a hell of a lot of energy, and it's highly complex manufacturing process to produce this resource. And so it is extremely high risk. tying the country's future to a commodity as volatile as oil is also a high-risk endeavor. So here it is. This is what it's all about. It's about putting holes in the ground. This is another example of extreme or difficult oil. This is, where offshore oil in the Gulf of Mexico, where we are now drilling 2 miles beneath the ocean floor to get oil. Another extreme adventure is the fracking of shale gas, which is happening at a rapid pace in northern British Columbia. And this is where we're drilling 1 mile to 2 miles into the ground, and then another mile or 2 horizontally, and then we're setting off explosive charges, and we are causing small earthquakes in the region to fracture rock as thick as concrete, to release minute amounts of methane. And we will do this over a 16 square kilometer area, and in the process, we have triggered as many as 70 earthquakes in northern BC in the last 2 to 3 years. And some of these earthquakes have been as high as 4 on the Richter scale. So here's bitumen. Here's what bitumen looks like. Everyone, and I'm always, they said, Andrew, you can't call it tar sands. And then I reply, the question I always ask an audience is, does anyone see any oil floating on top of sand here? No. And the reason, although occasionally I'll have one brave soul, I think I see it. But it's not there. And the reason industry and government and lawyers, especially corporate lawyers in Calgary, want to call it the oil sands because it makes it sound like everything it is not. It makes it sound cheap, easy, and accessible, and it's none of those things. That's bitumen locked in sand and clay. It's a heavy, gooky form of hydrocarbon that has been badly degraded by bacteria over 300 million years, and it looks like tar, smells like tar. Oh, but let's not call it tar. In fact, you can even pave a road with this crap, and it has been done. But you can't put that in your car. What you have to do is you have to pull it out of the ground. All right, dig these big holes. Then you mix it in a slurry with water to separate the sand and the clay. And then you have to upgrade the bitumen. Why? Because the bitumen is carbon rich and it's hydrogen poor. So you've got to pull that carbon out and you've got to add hydrogen. And that hydrogen usually comes in the form of cracked natural gas. And in this process, you're creating millions of tons and piles of petroleum coke. Right? So this is not like light oil, guys. I mean, this is not what we do with light oil. So we're pulling out all this petroleum coke. We're pulling out massive mountains of sulfur and other impurities because you don't want to be running your vehicle on that either. So, is it dirty? Yes, it is dirty. Now, we used to call this the magic sand pile in Alberta. And here, and I love this line, in the tar sands of Alberta is a unique opportunity for industry, an opportunity and a challenge in the free land of free enterprise. And the challenge, of course, always was how the hell do we get this bitumen out of the ground in a way that makes any kind of economic sense, right? So, we didn't know how to do it. In the 1960s, I mean, we've been trying since the 1900s. And everything was failing or blowing up or one problem or another. In the 1960s, a geologist gets this brilliant idea. He says, why don't we nuke it, melt all the bitumen underneath the forest floor, and then we'll just pump it up, like regular oil. So he took this idea to the Alberta government, and they said, that's a great idea. And then, I kid you not, then the Alberta government took it to the American government, and the American government said, we'll give you the bomb. And then they went to Atlantic Richfield and they said, we have just the site for you, just south of Fort McMurray, and and we'll drill a hole about 1 mile in the ground, we'll set off the nukes, and voila, we'll have oil. Now, fortunately, saner minds prevailed, and I must add, they were American mines, they were not Canadian mines, but the Russians got word of this, and they said, you know what, we'll try this on our heavy oil in Siberia, and to this day, they have learned that there is yet no market for radioactive oil. So here was our solution. This is what we came up with. We thought, okay, how are we going to get this stuff out of the ground? Trucks and shovels. That's it. This is what industry likes to call innovation. But, you know, really big trucks, the size of a Boeing 747, you know, I mean, these are massive. And a shovel operation. And so we're digging. Now, the deposits are vast. This is one of the extraordinary things about unconventional resources is that they're crappy, they're low quality, they're high cost, high energy and everything else, but there usually, unfortunately, tends to be massive deposits of them, which makes economists think at the end of the day that it's all worthwhile. So we have 3 deposits that are about the size of Florida in Alberta, and 60% of all of these deposits have now been leased. So what we're really saying is that we're prepared to industrialize a forest, 60% of a forest the size of Florida. Now, here's the other extraordinary thing about bitumen. It is high cost. This chart just shows you where the oil sands are in the scheme of things. You've got Middle East oil, still among the world's cheapest oil, if you don't cost all the American GIs and Marines and naval ships and planes and wars and everything else that have been secured that oil. But oil sands is a sign that business as usual cannot continue, that the world of cheap oil is over. It costs, you have to get a return somewhere between 60 to 80 bucks a barrel to make it work. Carbon footprint, you bet, huge. It's not the world's largest, but it is among the world's most significant carbon footprints coming from hydrocarbons on the planet. You notice that there's a hell of a big blob there coming from Iran. It's got very, very contaminated product. Big blob coming from parts of Africa where you've got a lot of natural gas in oil. And of course, we've got a big blob from Fort McMurray because of the energy intensity of getting this stuff out of the ground and then enriching it. Now here's another way to look at the quality of the product. Here's the American Petroleum Institute. They rate hydrocarbons on the basis of gravity and density, and bitumen is right at the bottom of the chart. It is a heavy, heavy, dense crude that will not move through a pipeline unless you dilute it. How much natural gas do we use to produce bitumen on a daily basis? We use enough natural gas, and the majority of it's being used to upgrade the bitumen into something called synthetic crude to enrich it, right? We're using enough natural gas to heat 6 million homes a day. So this project is primarily being subsidized at this point in time by another hydrocarbon, and that is natural gas. By 2030, the Cambridge Energy Research Associates in the United States, as Daniel Yergin's group, it's one of the really, really big oil analysts on the continent, they figure that 35% of Canada's natural gas production will all be going to Fort McMurray to produce bitumen. And a lot of people in the oil and gas industry think that's a really stupid and bad idea. That's like using gold to produce lead. Now, here's Robert Skinner from Statoil. He has this to say about the natural gas. He said, Grandpa, he's having a conversation with his grandchild. Grandpa, did you do that? Did you take gas from the Arctic down to the Alberta to boil water to make steam to melt tar out of the oil sands, then use more natural gas to produce hydrogen to make the tar molecules into gasoline so North Americans could drive 5-ton vehicles 5 kilometers and spend 15 minutes riding stationary bikes? Grandpa, did you really do that? We're doing it. Carl Clark, one of the scientists involved in figuring out how to get bitumen out of the ground, he used his wife's washing machine, much to her dismay. But he knew how dirty the resource was, and he said, look, you can't continue business as usual on this. This is the second line of defense. You know, Jeff Rubin, the former chief economist for CIBC, puts it this way. You know, when it takes 2 tons of sand to produce 1 barrel of oil, you know you're at the bottom of the 9th inning. And here's the problem. I mean, oil is kind of the Viagra of the species. When we really got hooked on hydrocarbons, our numbers exploded for a number of reasons. But now, you know, we're hit this really expensive stuff. We're peaking out. Peaking doesn't mean the end of anything. It just means the end of affordable stuff. And here's Colin Campbell, very famous geologist, now lives in Ireland, worked for almost all the multinationals, and explaining peak oil, you know, it's like going to the bar and you buy a glass of beer, and before you know it, you're staring depletion in the face, and that's what's happening now with global oil supplies. Now in Canada, we've been very busy beavers since the 1970s and 1980s, so this is just to give you a sense of how quickly this project has been growing. The mining projects alone will, once they've all been dug up, occupy an area the size of the state of Rhode Island or Delaware. In the process, we've already dug up 7 Panama canals in terms of dirt. You know, that's what Canadians do. And now we're proposing that we want to expand this threefold because that's what the approval of the Northern Gateway project means. David Hughes used to work for Natural Resources Canada, was one of the country's foremost energy analysts, has this to say. The oil sands supply will grow by 217% over 210 levels by 2035, seemingly in order to justify the added capacity of the Northern Gateway pipeline, is highly optimistic and represents a focus on corporate growth at the expense of the long-term energy security and environmental interests of Canadians. I don't think anyone has put it better than that. All right, now, there are 3 issues, social, economic, and political issues I want to raise, and then quickly 3 environmental issues, and then I want to wrap this up. So the Dutch disease, you've probably heard a bit about this, and you're probably wondering, is this contagious? Is this a sexual thing? You know, and so we've had 3 different Western premiers say doesn't exist in Canada. We've had Thomas Mulcair, the new leader of the NDP, say, no, wait a moment, this is an issue for this country. And it's about regional disparities, and it's about too much money in all in one place, and it's about the decline of the manufacturing sector in Canada. We need to talk about it. And the official version is, there's no worries. Canada has a new Hummer, and it's the tar sands, and it's only going to bring good things to the rest of the country. And yet that's really bullshit. Here's the blue is the price of oil. The red is Canadian dollar. So when you export, when 30% of your exports are now bitumen, and they are in this country, that resource determines the value of your currency. Oil, almost always around the world, sets a nation's currency when they become oil exporters. So we have a petrocurrency that goes up and down like a yo-yo with the price of oil. That's going to affect other sectors of the economy. The Business Council of BC noted just a couple of years ago that every time the Canadian dollar goes up by 1 cent, the forestry industry in this province loses $500 million. And when you have one project driving Canadian currency up phenomenally from around 60 cents to now the fact that it's on par with the US dollar, you have a tremendous and phenomenal impact on the rest of the country. The Bank of Canada has noticed something's going on. A fairly tight and long-standing relationship between energy prices and the Canadian dollar implies that fluctuations in oil prices affect the overall competitiveness of Canadian exports to the rest of the world. You don't have to tell Ontario and Quebec manufacturers that. So here's the Dutch disease. The first example was in Holland, 1970s. They were developing natural gas. It changed the value of their currency, but they started off with a healthy manufacturing and agricultural sector. Then they got hooked on natural gas stream of revenue, and which diminished and changed the other sectors because the value of the guilder grew so phenomenally. And then you have this imbalanced economy dependent on one primary resource. Jeff Rubin says that what happened to Holland is pretty rinky-dink compared to what is now happening to Canada with bitumen. And in fact, he says in the future, people won't be talking about the Dutch disease, they'll be talking about the Canadian disease. And here's an example of it at work. You can see crude petroleum oils and oils obtained from in the blue scale, and the red one being the automotive and manufacturing sector. Here we have an example from Stats Canada just showing the dramatic losses in the manufacturing sector. They are about 500,000 jobs from 2004 to around 2010 have disappeared for a variety of reasons. I'm not suggesting the tar sands and petrocurrency are the only reason, but the economists who have done the studies say that about a third of these job losses can be attributed to our petrocurrency and the rapid development of the tar sands. Now, the other thing you've got to understand about this project, as it has been currently configured, is that it's all about exporting jobs. Every time you export 400,000 barrels of bitumen, you are exporting 18,000 refining and upgrading jobs that could have happened here in this country. And that's what Gateway is about. It's about exporting jobs to China, and that's what Keystone is about. It's about exporting jobs to refineries owned by the Koch brothers in Saudi Arabia and Texas and Louisiana. Robin Allen, a critical and very smart economist and used to be head of the British Columbia Insurance Corporation, has this to say about Northern Gateway. You build this thing and it will have an inflationary effect, not just on the economy of British Columbia, but on the economy of Canada. Now, so the Dutch disease is one gift that this project has already given us. Petrostate is another, and this is important stuff. Petrostates rely on an unsustainable development trajectory, sound familiar, fueled by an inexhaustible resource, and the very returns produced by this resource form an implacable barrier to change. Now, I come from a petrostate called Alberta, which has been ruled by one party for 41 years, which is not untypical of petrostates. When you have a state that runs on revenue from hydrocarbons, that's a cheap and easy source of revenue, those states can have the means to sustain themselves in power for a long time. So what do all petrostates look like, whether in the Middle East, Africa, Russia, North America, or elsewhere? Where the first thing you do, they want you to feel good and warm and fuzzy about your good geological good fortune and that they lower the taxes. But if you lower taxes and you run on petrodollars, then you no longer represent your citizens. You break the whole relationship between representation and taxation. And the governments come to represent the resource or the resource developers. Then they overspend like hell. I mean, we've run 3 deficits in Alberta, supposedly the wealthiest jurisdiction in North America, in the last 3 years in a row. You see this phenomenal concentration of power. There's no statecraft in a petrostate. Everything will be solved by liberally moving money around, but God forbid that anyone sits down and actually solves the problem with clear-eyed thinking and cold sweat. And then you court secrecy. When taxation is absent, populations tend to be politically inactive, relatively obedient, and surprisingly loyal, and that's the best definition you'll ever find of an Albertan. We had a premier for 14 years that was known as a king, no less. Where else are you going to find a fellow like that except in the Middle East? Hugo Chavez is another example of a populist petro-politician. They come in both guises of the right and of the left. Sarah Palin, the ever-charming Alaska petro-politician. The not-so-charming fellow from Libya. By the way, he was in power for 42 years. And Vladimir Putin, he's a petro-politician. He's nationalized all of the hydrocarbon resources in Russia. He knows his future is dependent on revenue from oil and gas. Margaret Thatcher was a petro-politician. She used the proceeds from the North Sea oil to fund her political revolution the same way Stephen Harper is using corporate taxes from bitumen being produced in northern Alberta to fund his political revolution in Canada. George W. Bush. Texas, by the way, produced 4 presidents of the United States. And here's our petro-politician, Stephen Harper. Now, a few things you need to know about Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper is the son of an Imperial Oil executive who was an accountant for Imperial Oil, which most Americans know as ExxonMobil. which is one of the world's largest corporations. A great book on this corporation was just written by Steve Cole, and it's an extraordinary account of oil and power and politics. Now, this man does not believe in climate change. This man does not support science. And this man believes that environmentalists are a form of evil that must be taken out in the crudest way possible. Now, he is a fundamentalist, evangelical, Protestant Christian. There's nothing wrong with that. I am a Christian myself. But the sect that he belongs to specifically believes that renewables are bad, the world will be determined by fossil fuels, that climate change is a myth, and that environmentalists are out to destroy the economy. That is the sect he is part of. And that explains a great deal of what's going on in this country. There we go. We're going backwards. What's happening here? Yeah. Okay. Whoa!
That's a good one.
That's no good. Keith, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Just let me look around.
It's a commercial break for us.
Yeah.
So,
Just one second.
See what he
Andrew, quit calling China communist China. It's Nazi China.
Back, Stephen.
all right. Let's see what happens now. See if we can. All right. Here we go. All right. So, what's our policy on climate change? We don't have one in this country. We're not going anywhere. Here's the Auditor General saying Environment Canada's forecasts show that targets will not be met with existing measures. All right? We're not going anywhere. We're like the Saudis. Our government does not believe climate change is an issue or a threat. And in fact, the Canadian government, both Liberal and Tories, have spent more than $9 billion on programs that have achieved nothing. All right, so now we have this budget bill, which other folks will talk about, but Bill C-38, it's not a budget bill. There are 70 pieces of legislation that are all being tinkered with or gutted with this legislation. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, ditched. Canadian Environmental Protection Act, undercut. National Roundtable on the Economy and Environment, killed. Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, seriously weakened. Kyoto Protocol, gone. Fisheries Act, seriously gutted. Energy Board, neutered. Nuclear Safety Control, undermined. Water and Environmental Monitoring, cut. Everyone in this room should be upset about this political attack on the country. Now, do we have any vision? No, we have no vision. Then we have this issue with scientists. This guy is a government minder, and he went to a Montreal conference on the Arctic, and his job was to make sure this guy didn't say anything that might embarrass the government or that might actually be truthful about the state of climate change in the Arctic. And what does Nature, one of the world's best science magazines, say about all this? Well, prominent researchers have been prevented from discussing published peer-reviewed literature. Policy directives and emails reveal a confused and Byzantine approach to the press, prioritizing message control, showing little understanding of the importance of the free flow of scientific knowledge. It is time for the Canadian government to set its scientists free. We have an environment minister now, Peter Kent, former journalist, who talks about ethical oil, but has really nothing to say about the environmental consequences of this project, which will likely lead to the eradication of woodland caribou in northern Alberta. But Peter Kent is not upset. He says the species does not face an imminent threat, whereas almost every scientist you talk to, which is why these guys have to be muzzled, says no, they're in danger and they're on their way out. The money. We're Canadians, we don't like talking about money, but Alberta has a low royalty and tax rates for the oil sands, which promotes greater production. That's coming from the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations, a nonpartisan group, which have made the correct observation that we're giving it away. Who's making the most money in all of this? Well, it's the federal government, actually. It's not Alberta. They make most of the money from corporate taxes, about $5 billion a year. And what does the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, not known as a radical green group, say? Well, you know, in Norway, companies receive 22% of net revenues, but something's funny is going on in Alberta, where companies receive 53% of net revenues. No wonder the Chinese are here. Now, the Norwegians had a conversation about their oil wealth. They decided to save the money for the future and to stabilize their currency by doing so, and their fund is worth more than $500 billion. And this is what happens when countries actually have conversations about their resources. And they also had something else happen. Oh no. Oh. All right, that's what we've saved, right? But here's an interesting quick story. Farooq Al-Qassim, an Iraqi petroleum engineer, married a Norwegian, had a child with cerebral palsy, moves to Norway in the 1970s when the Norwegians strike oil in the North Sea. The Norwegians are fishing and farming and logging people, and with lots of hydroelectricity, they have no idea what to do with the oil. This guy shows up on their front door. They hire him within 3 days, and he says, look, why don't you do it differently? And they do. And his advice to Canada has been, save the money, go slow.
Okay.
Now, 3 environmental issues. So we've got big money issues we're not talking about in this country. We have the Dutch disease, and we have this corrosive politics of the petrostate now firmly entrenched in the country. Regulatory neglect, big issue. This project is taking place in the world's 3rd largest watershed. That's the Mackenzie Basin. So here's all the crud coming off the upgrading projects. It's deposited on the land in snow. The snow melts in the spring, taking into the Athabasca River anywhere between 3,000 to 6,000 barrels of naphthenic acids, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and oil, all the way down into Lake Athabasca. Where the Denny and Cree are now pulling fish out of the lake that look like this, with cancers and various deformities, and where Alberta's Cancer Board is saying that the community of Fort Chip has higher than expected levels of bile, lymphatic, and blood cancers, 30% higher, and we have not yet seen a health study on that issue. We have, again, the Auditor General saying, hey, what's going on in Alberta? Insufficient data to monitor the oil sands. The department's freshwater quality monitoring program has no baseline measures or long-term data to track changes in water quality and aquatic ecosystem health in the Athabasca River. 2011, same message. Incomplete environmental baselines, environmental data monitoring systems. We have to do this to consider it in a thorough and systematic manner, the cumulative impact of the oil sands. And if we don't have that baseline data, we can't do that. Now, the steam plants, we mine bitumen or we steam it out of the ground. And we're having some rather novel things take place where the steam comes back where we don't want it, and we create 300-meter craters in the forest. And the steam that it goes into the ground often makes contact with the groundwater, and here's the state of groundwater mapping in the region, status unknown, risk unknown. Here's scientists, again, those folks that Harper wants to muzzle. Knowledge is lacking as to whether the aquifers in the Athabasca oil sands region can withstand these groundwater demands and losses. Are you getting the picture? Reclamation, the last issue here. 170 square miles of mining waste. Okay, these are big mining projects, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into these impoundments. That's about the size of the city downtown of Vancouver. You could flood downtown Vancouver with mining waste from this project. So there's 6 billion barrels of it now on the landscape in these huge raised earthen dikes. You could fill a 10 by 10 meter canal from Vancouver all the way to Halifax with mining waste from this project. Cost $20 billion to clean it up. What have we set aside? What have we asked all these wealthy multinationals and state-owned oil companies to set aside? $1 billion. Outrageous. Again, a group of scientists saying something, the current system lacks a reasonable systematic risk management approach to avoid claims on the public purse arising from inadequate financial security. We're very good at taking boreal landscapes like this and, oops, turning them into this. Now, and this is our mandate, to restore them to equivalent land capability. Not even George Orwell could come up with an expression like, and that's what we're doing. But the implications are profound because the land we are destroying, 60% of it are peatland. Peatland is a remarkable carbon sink, and within, we are destroying up to $2 billion worth of natural capital by digging up these peatlands on a regular basis. And we don't include this. The last are carbon liabilities. Well, we all know that this is a big footprint, right? This is Canada's largest growing source of emissions, 46 million tons a year, and that's all coming from 1.5 million barrels a day approximately. By 2020, we're going from 7% of the nation's emissions to 18% of the nation's emissions, with no plan. Here's industry showing where the emissions are going. They agree. And here's Mark Jakari, one of the most conservative, tight-assed academics you can ever imagine, a brilliant guy. I think he's at UBC or Simon Fraser, and an expert on Simon Fraser, okay, and on climate change and hydrocarbons. And this is what he thinks about the impact of the Gateway Pipeline. You build this, Canada will never meet any of its carbon obligations or promises. He says, our political leaders are lying to us if they aid and abet the expansion of tar sands while promising to take action to prevent the imminent climate catastrophe. You cannot build this pipeline and be responsible in terms of climate change. So where do we go and what do you do? And this is where I'm inviting all of you tonight to get engaged as Canadians, as British Columbians, and also as oil consumers. We are all part of this problem. We all use, on average, 24 barrels of oil a year. So whether we like it or not, we are part of this culture that we have created over the last 150 years, and now we need to be part of the solution. So what do? St. Francis has got it wrapped up. Start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. City of Prince Rupert says no to Gateway. First Nations say no to Gateway. If you love whales, humpback whales have returned to this region on the coast, and it is outside of the Douglas Channel, where the Gitgat people live, that the whales compose their mating songs that they will sing in Hawaii and Mexico. And what will 300 supertankers do to these humpback populations along this coast? And to the First Nations people who are tied to these whales, who are tied to the harvest of sea kelp and to the incredibly rich coastline that is there. So what do you have to do as citizens? Well, first and foremost, you say no to the pipeline, and then you demand a national debate about the scale and pace of this mining project in Alberta that is changing the character of the country. And you don't demand NDP MLAs or MPs. You go and you find a Tory and you make it plain to this Tory, because Tories only listen to Tories in the political scheme of things. You make it clear that as a Canadian, you want to change and you want a national debate. You tell them too, you want a national carbon tax. You tell them that they have to take the money off the table and that you don't want Stephen Harper to fund his political revolution with oil money from Alberta. That money should be put aside and saved for future generations so that our politicians are accountable to taxpayers and not to big oil. We all need to do this. It's not easy. Last word, Nassim Taleb, fabulous economic thinker, mathematician, philosopher, originally from Lebanon, has this to say. We become civilized only by knowing what to refrain from doing. Help us do that. Thank you.